Overdose deaths and millions of relapses. COVID stimulus checks may have contributed to a surge in drug use, especially fentanyl. And the source of the fentanyl flooding into the United States? Well, it's China.
Some say this constitutes an act of war as it's destroying America from within. Chuck Holton investigates this crisis in one of the hardest hit areas, Appalachia.
2020 saw a record 92,000 drug overdoses across the United States. And while final 2021 numbers have yet to be released, the total looks to be higher still. The crisis is being driven by the ultra-potent drug fentanyl.
Fentanyl is the most powerful painkiller that's on the market today, and it has a very, very hard effect on the user. It's 100 times more potent than morphine.
Only 2 milligrams of fentanyl can be lethal. In 2021, U.S. Customs and Border Protection seized more than 11,000 pounds of fentanyl in the United States, enough to kill more than 2.5 billion people. Distributors are lacing it with less potent drugs like marijuana, meth, and heroin, often without the knowledge of the user.
It's not just deaths from fentanyl. It's death, increasingly fentanyl mixed with methamphetamines and with cocaine.
We are finding in our drug screening almost every methamphetamine positive also has a fentanyl positive. Once that first high occurs, nothing after that compares.
West Virginia saw a 40% increase in the number of overdose deaths just in 2020 alone, and fentanyl played an increasing part in those 1,200 deaths. But if you talk to experts here in West Virginia, they'll tell you that it's also the U.S. government's response to the pandemic that's to blame.
Unfortunately, the stimulus monies that were distributed throughout the country as a way to address lost income attributed greatly to overdose deaths and to overdose near deaths and millions of relapses. We've seen a significant uptick in clients in the recent months.
This former addict agrees.
I got that big chunk of money. Well, that big chunk of money was gone within days. Sitting at home, being bored, having nothing else to do, already being an addict, you know, hey, let's get high.
But the costs soon became all too real.
Back in November, I lost a very, very dear friend of mine to an overdose. I think that, yeah, the pandemic had a lot to do with it, to be honest.
The source of the fentanyl flooding America's streets might come as a surprise. According to data compiled by the Drug Enforcement Administration, illicit fentanyl is primarily manufactured in China and smuggled into the United States through Mexico. Some say this should constitute an act of war.
Well, we should consider each of those deaths a murder because China wanted Americans dead. China knows exactly what's going on. So when they sell fentanyl, you have to assume that this is Communist Party policy.
These experts fear fentanyl may prove to be our adversary's most powerful weapon, defeating America from the inside out.
Every time someone says fentanyl, we should be saying China. Unfortunately, that's not the case.
If our enemies can destroy our youth who fight our wars, then they've already won the battle.
From Southern West Virginia, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Now, the opioid epidemic, and it is an epidemic, is a national tragedy. You look back at the history of it and, you know, how people got hooked on these things. There were this overdose of prescriptions, if you will. But now we're into yet another phase of it, and China is absolutely fueling it. And they know the fentanyl manufacturers. It's not some surprise to them. At various points in time, the U.S. government has objected and China has given lip service to cracking down on it, but still there's a flood of fentanyl into our country. And it's remarkably cheap to manufacture, and that's why the drug traffickers are using it. From the Chinese point of view, they think this is payback. And you go back in history to the Opium Wars, and we conveniently forget those, but the British East India Company went to war against China twice, not just once, twice, to make sure that their country was open to opium imports. The opium came out of India, and then they distributed it through China, and it caused a national tragedy of addiction. You go back and look through Chinese history, you see the horrible photographs, the destroyed families. They have a very personal experience with addiction, and they know what the devastating consequences are. So is this payback? I think you can say yes, and we need to realize what's happening. There's another opium war happening, and it's happening right here in the United States.